Hi, welcome to week 4 of Reconciliation in Romans. This week we're going to talk about culture and how we can be agents of change in our culture. So, culture is defined by Merriam and Webster as the beliefs, customs, arts, etc. of a particular society, group, place, or time. It can also be known as a particular society that has its own beliefs, ways of life, art, etc. So, when we think about this, we can recognize that we have many different cultures within our own sphere of influence. And so we have American culture, we have Pacific Northwest culture, where I'm from. Salem, the city that I live in, has its own culture, and even within Salem, we have different cultures. Like, there's a difference between middle class West Salem culture and the culture that exists within the lives of those who live outside. So very different cultures, but they live right next door to each other. We have different cultures in different churches. So Hispanic church, the Hispanic Foursquare Church in our city is going to look very different than our middle-class West Salem Foursquare Church. That's just a reality. So we have different cultures. We have different cultures within our families too. When I married Mark, see, we're both white middle-class people, but the dynamics of our families are very different. So, for example, we just celebrated holidays with our family, and Mark pretty much refuses to go to most of the events that his family puts on because they're so toxic and dysfunctional, whereas my family works really hard to be as functional as possible and loving at all costs. So we tend to go to my family's events over his family's events. And so we come from two different cultures and at the same time are creating a culture of how we function within our greater families. And we're creating that culture for ourselves and for our son. So cultures are vast, and we run in different circles of culture. We have different cultures at work and at church and in our families, and so different cultures throughout. So they're very diverse and dynamic. Now, something to be aware of is that we can be agents of change within our cultures. An example of this was when my dad, who used to be a drug dealer, suddenly became a Christian after watching one of his friends nearly die in a car accident. That so changed his life. It was a pivotal point in his life that he ran to the closest church, found the youth pastor, and asked him what he needed to do to have everlasting life. Became a Christian. The next day went to school, and so many people were enamored with the extravagant change in his life that he actually, within the next week, was able to lead several people to the Lord because he was part of one culture and jumped into another culture and had such a radical change. So he was the first Christian in his family, and others became Christians because of his influence. So let's look at reconciliation. Reconciliation essentially means to resolve or to restore. Now we're reading in Romans about reconciliation with Christ. We find this theme over and over throughout the book of Romans. But I'm wondering if we can have a conversation about how talking about things and being a part of actions and movements can work to change the culture that we're in, to resolve something within our culture, to reconcile something. And I'm wondering, what would it be for you that you would reconcile within your own culture, whether it's in your family or within your church, within your school? What would you like to see change, to reconcile? For me, it was mental illness. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 21 years old. And bipolar disorder essentially means that my body has a difficult time regulating between my moods in my emotions. So I toggle back and forth between feeling too high, too manic, which could be looked at as over creative and extra happy, inappropriately happy. And then I toggle to the other side of the spectrum, which includes depression. And the depths of the depression that I've experienced are developing suicidal tendencies and self-mutilation. So I have experienced high highs and very low lows before finding a medication that worked for me, a series of medications actually. So I treat bipolar disorder through a variety of therapies, including medication, psychiatry, counseling, accountability with an accountability partner, being mentored by a couple of different very influential people in my life, having a safe family, exercising, making sure I'm getting all the nutrients I need in my food, and practicing spiritual disciplines. So these are all things that I do in order to be healthy. But when I was diagnosed at 21, I had been living with the illness since I was about 13. That's when the symptoms first came on. So I was used to living in a dysfunctional way and had to learn how to live in a functional way. So I had to change my own person and my own habits. But I wanted to do more than that. What I discovered when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder is that there was such a stigma about mental illness that it seemed like we weren't allowed to talk about it. In fact, when I first started getting help for bipolar disorder, I sat with my grandmother and talked to her a little bit about it. She said, "I'm really glad that you're doing what you need to do to be healthy, but please don't ever tell anyone about this." I don't know if it was that she was ashamed or if it was probably more that she was worried that I would be hurt by a culture that didn't yet accept mental illness as part of life. So she tried to discourage me from sharing my story. But what I found almost immediately was that sharing my story was an important part of being healthy. So we've talked before about storytelling and how story is important. And I discovered that through the process of getting healthy and living a functional life with a mental illness. So I am an advocate for mental health awareness, and I have discovered that there are very few people that can reach the mental illness community within the church. The only ones that really can very successfully are those who deal with it and are dealing with it in a healthy way. So I'm not just healthy for myself, I'm also healthy because I believe God has called me to be able to speak to those who are trying to find God through very difficult circumstances, through illness. And I have a voice that is somewhat unique in that, and I try to steward it well. So I want to be an agent for change when it comes to mental health and the church. And I think that that's important, and I have seen good fruit come from it. My little brother, who has not been diagnosed with a mental illness, but probably will someday when he sees the right people. Right now, he's just trying to manage on his own. But he and I have had many conversations about depression, especially. He came to me crying one day because he was so depressed, and he said, "I don't know who to tell except you, because you've already shared your story." It's a thing that my friend Ann Jackson writes about she wrote a book called Permission to Speak Freely. And it's the idea that when you share your story with someone, you give them the permission to share their own story and to open up. And so that's how we can be agents of change within our culture. So for me, it's mental illness. It's also human trafficking. It's also sex addiction. It's whatever I have come across that has kept me far from God. As the Lord has reconciled me to Him, I have found opportunities to speak out in my culture and in the various cultures that I exist in and say, I want to change this culture so that I can talk about addiction, and so that I can talk about self-mutilation, so that I can talk about depression and not being able to balance my emotions correctly without the help of therapy. So these are ways that we can be agents of change within our culture. So what I'd like you to think about throughout this week is your own culture or your set of cultures and how you would like to see something in them changed. That you want to see something reconciled, something set right. And think about that thing, and then we will talk about it in our forum discussion this week. So I look forward to reading your forum discussions, and This will be the last interpretation assignment that you turn in, week 4. Next week we will be looking at a paper that you'll be writing. And so if you get a chance this week, in fact, make a chance. Make a time to sit down with the information that's in week 5 to look ahead at what the paper will look like, and so that you won't just be shell-shocked when week 5 comes around and you have to write this paper. Be preparing yourself for that emotionally and mentally. So look at the paper, work on your interpretation assignment, and log into the forums, and we will have a discussion about being agents of change within our culture. I look forward to reading your posts.